we can't have ultimately large language models or machines learn off human creation, create works that can compete with those human created works, and then savage the market for commercial music and therefore the value for human creation.
This podcast is sponsored by Allfeed, a decentralized blockchain solution for the music industry. Produced by Amplitude Ventures, your partners in early stage music tech. On another music tech episode with Becky Brook, we explore the complex legal and ethical landscape surrounding AI music generation. It's all about Suno, lawsuits, licensing confusion, and whether the music industry is honestly broken. One of the important conversations I've had on the show, buckle up. Hey guys, welcome back to a special episode of the Sound Connections podcast. One of my good friends are in the studio. Becky, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me again.
Becky, we're going to do a different type of episode, and it's almost like expert commentary on movements in the music industry. And I usually don't do these, but I think it was so interesting to talk about this, and there was no one better than you to talk about it with. So, Becky, we're going to talk about some things happening in the music industry right now with legally, with music generation and major labels. And I have on purpose, and I disclaimed this before I went into the call, not researched this in detail because I would love to understand it from a much more basic angle. So, Becky, people can go listen to your episode from last time, but very basically, just to set the scene, who are you and what do you do?
I'm a music and technology advisor who focuses predominantly on music rights, and I mostly work with startups who want to use music rights for their product or pitch services to music rights holders. But occasionally I work with large music and games companies if they have a sideline project that needs either music rights knowledge or tech implementation knowledge for music rights, that kind of thing.
Great. And that's very relevant for today because we're going to talk about, well, maybe you can introduce what's happening, and then I'll be listening and asking questions. So, Becky, what is happening out there right now?
Well, when we caught up late last year, we were talking about we talked about the high level licensing landscape, and then we also talked about sort of music licensing for AI and large language models at a very high level, at a kind of right at beginners. And I think when we spoke, we said we'd catch up in 3 months, and I think we were hoping that maybe in 3 months there'd be a bit more clarity. Well, we're kind of pretty much almost 9 months since we spoke, maybe 8, and really we haven't got much more clarity. It's the unfortunate reality. Lots has happened, and we could talk more about those movements, but realistically, I think the picture's getting murkier in the short term rather than clearer.
And that is really the interesting part of this conversation today. Is I'm confused right now. So I've seen some headlines with Suno and major labels and potentially striking licensing deals. Could you explain to me what is sort of going on, at least on the headlines in the media, and what might that mean?
So I guess there is the kind of major news in terms of music AI and lawsuits and or discussions. And then I think there is broader recent findings from AI, which we should also talk about more broadly, which are not music specific, which undoubtedly are likely to impact how we think about music and AI. So in terms of the sort of music industry and AI licensing, the Suno and Udio lawsuits are still rolling on. It's going to be a while before we see the outcome of them. Same with Anthropic. And we should talk about Anthropic example in more detail, because that one, there has been more movement on the music publishers suing Anthropic, and that's definitely like some of the things that have happened since we've spoken on that particular lawsuit are interesting to learn from. But still, frankly, we haven't really got any meaningful outcomes in the music industry sense. So that is to say, all of the high profile large language models that are being sued by one or many parts of the music industry, mostly those are still open cases. So we're really we're having to look beyond music and look at earlier lawsuits from things like publishers, book publishers, or authors to look at early findings from these lawsuits. So it's a fascinating time. And I think in the meantime, what we're definitely starting to see is the suggestion that Suno and Udio starting to try and license. Now, we don't know how serious their attempts are, but it's a really fascinating time because I definitely was quite how do I put this? It was something to the effect of, there was an announcement that Suno and Udio were starting to talk to the majors about licensing, and it was like, and then there was definitely quite a lot of pushback from the both the startups that had been trying to do it the right way from the start, I trying to get licenses, and then there was also pushback, I think, from other camps concerned about what those deals might look like.
Mm.
And I think the former camp, the people who feel so somewhat cheated, that they tried to do it the right way and possibly they're still not licensed. And then you have those who, like Suno and Udio, or maybe even Anthropic, who didn't make any effort to license their rights and now are getting a seat at the same licensing tables, and they seem to feel somewhat cheated. And I was kind of somewhat surprised. I'd say quite surprised by that, because it's naive to think that if Suno and Udio are coming to the table that the majors can't engage. Doesn't mean they'll agree a deal, doesn't mean it'll agree a fair deal. But the reality was, as soon as those large language model companies want to talk about music rights, the majors have to talk to them. They'd be stupid not to commercially, but also they can't be seen to refuse to license, not least because they're suing them for not getting licenses. Yeah. So if they're then shown to frustrate it and refuse to license, that would definitely long-term work against them in court. So it's a really fascinating time. I think it's understandable, if you're a startup who's been trying to do it the right way, that you would be frustrated that you've been trying to do it the right way. You've probably spent hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars on legal fees and advisory fees. And you've probably spent a year or two, or maybe even 3, trying to license these rights. And maybe you've finished, or maybe you're still in the throes of finalizing those agreements. And it's understandable to feel hard done by. That is to say, we talked about this before, right? Like in our previous discussion, when we talked more broadly about music licensing, I think I said something to the effect of like, you're not really given a special deal for doing the right thing from the start. If anything, probably the precedent suggests that your deal is probably better for not licensing up front and waiting till you're sued. Because if you look at, how UGC services operate and their commercial models for licensing, because of the fact that they were kind of dragged into the licensing kicking and screaming, and they had DMCA protections to protect them essentially in early years. Essentially, UGC services have preferable terms essentially over normal streaming services like Spotify, and so it's understandable if you're a large language model or another AI generative model who has been making a concerted effort to license from the start. It's understandable to feel a bit hard done by, frankly, because the music industry has never given you a better deal for asking first. And unfortunately, the precedent definitely suggests that if you can fight it out in court, then you might get a better deal on the far side. Now, I wouldn't say you always do, of course. There are plenty of startups who got sued for infringement and the settlement amount bankrupted them, right? So it's not to suggest that you should always... I know it's not for a moment to suggest you shouldn't license up front, but more to say that it's understandable if you've been making an effort to license and investing a ton of capital into getting the rights. It's understandable to feel a bit hard done by the fact that if Suno or Udio gets a license in 6 months' time, they will have done it much quicker than the startups who tried up front, or they possibly might get better terms because of the fact they've gone through the court process and they've robustly fought out what needs licensing and what doesn't. And so I think it was naive of those startups to think that these discussions wouldn't happen between the majors and Suno and Udio. I think that would be silly. But it's understandable to also feel pissed off about it, like pissed off that you're not getting any progress despite being the ones who made the effort up front to invest in music rights.
And uh the sad part that really really justifies what you're saying is this is how a lot of the big companies in the market right now has done it and succeeded and is now sort of friendly with the music industry. Also, Spotify doing the way they did, and there's plenty of examples where like you can't just play by the books right away always. And Napster, and maybe I'm misinterpreting, but like I've seen this myself in my own studies. Like there needs to be this level of controversy to really get these things to change. Um,
I mean, if we look at the biggest music services available, uh, I don't think it's true to suggest Spotify wasn't licensed. They have always been licensed properly compared to people like YouTube, who went down the avenue of hiding behind behind user-generated DMCA mere conduit protections, or Musically, or people like that. People services that started as user-generated services were very lucky that they were able to, at least for a long time, hide behind legal protections designed for internet providers back at the turn of the century. And so um, I don't think you could I don't think you could say Spotify was the same as that. Spotify did get licenses from the start, but you're absolutely right to observe that some of the biggest companies now, because TikTok is essentially the base of TikTok is Musically, and Musically was unlicensed too, right? So I think it's true to say that many of the biggest platforms now that we have in the music industry started out unlicensed, and if they hadn't started out unlicensed, it's very likely one or many of them might not have ever got this scale.
Let me just re-ask that question again, because as I said it, I was mixing it with a different thought. Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Obviously, that's the case with Spotify. So let me just try that again. And just basically to support what you're saying, and also what I've seen over and over again, is there is plenty of companies that's been disruptive and also done a big change where that has been the model, that they need to ask sorry later, and have somewhat succeeded that way. So what are the specific examples we've seen on platforms like that are big now that has gone down this route of asking for permission later?
So I think there are a big swathe of companies that asked for permission later or ended up being sued, and lots of them don't survive those lawsuits, right? Because often the settlements are very substantial, and often it completely clears out the capital they have and more. And it's very hard, obviously, to get additional capital if all you're doing is handing over to the rights holders for historical settlements, not for growth. But if you look at the current largest platforms in the music industry, the reality is a good number of them started out without licenses, largely because they were able to operate under some degree of like DMCA mere conduit protections, because they were argued to be user generated platforms where, just to recap on that, it's like the basic principle of those protections from the turn of the century was around internet service providers not being sued for their users illegally downloading music. And when YouTube particularly came around 20 years ago, God, that's horrifying. When YouTube sort of started, I think it was 2004, 2005, they were able to tap into those same protections, because they were able to say, well, we don't know what our users are doing and we're not encouraging them to infringe. And for many, many years, that enabled them to scale aggressively, because they didn't have to worry about music rights. Now, I should be very clear and say YouTube and all of the other historically infringing services is very much a historical thing. But they were able to get out of the gate and get a good amount of scale before they had to worry about music rights. And that would be true of Musically as well, which then became what we now know as TikTok, because ByteDance acquired it. And so some of the biggest services built scale before getting music licensing. And you can see why that's appealing.
And again, now we're just sort of guessing, but I think when Suno, for example, got this rather large funding round last year, I believe it was. I'm sure that's what some of the conversations that's been going on in those rooms is just like, okay, we see there's a precedent for asking for permission later, and now we're going to try to create the best product ever and get some leverage of public sentiment and maybe play in courts until we get to a point where they need to settle. I can only imagine that would be the most natural assumption to have.
For sure. I think it's it makes a lot of sense to string this out at the stage they are. Like strategically, um, it makes sense for them to start dipping their toe into the licensing talks. But the reality is, they're not going to enter into substantial and widespread licenses until there's a bit more clarity from the current suits, right? And I say that's not to suggest they might not settle before their own suit is resolved, but until there's real clarity, and probably in the case of the question about do you need a license to train a large language model on copyrighted materials, realistically, that's probably going to end up going to the US Supreme Court. And so, it makes sense for them to seem to be acting in good faith by talking to the majors. And similarly, the majors need to engage in those discussions. But why at this stage would Suno hand over a large portion of their cash and their equity unless they felt they had to? I'm not suggesting that's a moral argument, by the way. Like, it's definitely not the moral argument. But but the reality is these large language models are based in the US. And let's be clear, all of both the UK and pretty much all of Europe and definitely the US, these are capitalist societies where if you're an incorporation, your obligations are primarily to your shareholders, right? And so the reality is, why would the shareholders don't want to put the money into this either? They don't want to put the money, investors don't want to generally put money into buying rights. Like, that's why there was I think, who was it, Sherry, who does and Water and Music do some great data around investment in music tech, but there was a separate statistic, and I can't remember the source, unfortunately, but I should probably try and dig it out, where essentially someone was able to show that licensed large language models raised something like 30% less than unlicensed large language models, because it shows, and let's be clear, those ones that are licensing copyright are generally raising smaller amounts too. Like, generally, as in they're setting out to raise smaller amounts. So you look at Suno, Udio, OpenAI, Anthropic, those are all unlicensed, right? And they are all being sued by one or more copyright holders. And they are the ones that have raised all the money. And they're also backed by the biggest tech companies. So, it's understandable, if you're working towards the interests of your shareholders, to not want to license music. But the moral argument would say, well, we can't have ultimately large language models or machines learn off human creation, create works that can compete with those human created works, and then savage the market for commercial music and therefore the value for human creation. And so, morally, I don't think it's right. But, the reality is these companies are incorporated in the US, and it would be very hard for them to do something different, frankly. But then what we have to look to is the law. We have to look to our legislators to sort of make sure the laws are robust enough to protect against this. And that's where things have really become very interesting in the last few months.
I have a question that I've been thinking about lately, and it's sort of trying to separate the emotional reaction to the logical reaction to what's going on. Because what I experience, on my LinkedIn environment, which suddenly is becoming very toxic, LinkedIn, I don't know what's happening to your algorithm, but is when people are reacting to things like, for example, Timbaland going out and launching, a new AI label, and he's been supporting and advertising for Suno for a while. Like, I see a lot of emotional reaction as by far the strongest, aspect of it. And I see less and less so, like, factual, logical, mathematical statements about what's going on and how that's going to damage the current industry. And obviously, there's going to be someone there fighting that battle. But I also perceive a lot of this being like a either conscious or subconscious reaction to the threat of quality that Suno is providing, like the livelihood of music, and that's sort of overshadowing the emotional landscape of the rightful allocation of payment to some degree. Like, I don't really have a question associated to it, but that's sort of the angle that I'm seeing real time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I can see why many of the arguments are emotional, because particularly if you're a creator or you've built your livelihood on making music or supporting human creators, I can see that why there would be an emotional response. Like you're um, you would understandably feel cheated because to your point about equality, right? Um, let's be frank, these outputs would suck where the input's not good. I mentioned it on the last podcast, and I can't actually remember whether it was Suno or Udio who said it. But one of them, when they first launched, obviously there was an immediate backlash, and one of this, I think it was one of the CEOs, said something to the effect of, uh, "We're we're not saying we licensed on commercial music, but if you want the best outputs, you have to put in the best inputs." And it's true to say, it's like large language models, they've leapt ahead in terms of how good the outputs are. They've got infinitely better in the last 10 years, as we've discussed previously. But if the inputs were just kind of production music and or public domain music, then the outputs would be far, far more limited in their quality and their scope, right? Public domain music is largely 70 something, 70 to 100 years old, right? So there's not going to be anything in modern styles. And if you look at what's production music, maybe excluding people like Song Trader and Epidemic, a lot of it's functional music, it's lift music, it's mood music. And so the reality is, I can understand if you're someone who's built your career around making music. I can understand why you feel cheated by these big companies. But I do also agree with your point about. I do absolutely agree with your point about the fact that ultimately there is a strong logical pushback as well. You don't have to just do it's not. You don't need to rely purely on the moral and emotional argument. You can simply say, well, this is copyright infringement. And I should say, it's definitely worth giving Ed credit for the work he did for MBW, analysing the Suno and Udio outputs, because he really clearly showed that the outputs were derived from the inputs if you use the right prompts. And so, I think it is, I think the industry has for too long taken a rather moral high road rather than a sort of analytical and factual approach to this. So I don't think I said it, I'm not sure I said it on the last podcast, but the fact that the industry has for the last 5 years or so sort of spent a lot of time talking about the superiority of human creation, and that's why copyright only benefits human creation, not machine creation. And I think that's a naive. I mean, I've used the word naive quite a lot today, but I think that's a wrong-headed approach.
Yeah.
I think ultimately, if, and it's a big if now, I think it's increasingly, the if is becoming bolder over time, but if it comes down in major jurisdictions that you need a license to train, why would you put your big commercial music into a large language model where the outputs are free of any copyright? Because as soon as they're created by the end user and made available in any form, then they're public for everyone to use for free because there's no copyright on them. And so I think it is incorrect to take this kind of approach that human creation is so much better than machine creation, and morally it's the only thing that can benefit from any kind of copyright, because if and when they are going to license Suno, Udio, etc., what's the commercial model if the outputs are free of copyright?
Yeah.
The commercial model, of course, we know will be equity and cash up front and some payments based on what users are paying to create the music. But if there's no way to commercialize the outputs in a meaningful sense, then the opportunity will be far less than the risk for these rights holders. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does make sense. And that's also the confusing part when these investors came into Suno, for example. It's just like, I was very perplexed to for what end? Like, what is the imagined end where the investor is going to have return on investment. And that's for me like the big question, because like there's so many unclears in this. Like what's going to be besides SaaS at scale, like what is the model there? And obviously, when you go into this battle, that there must be more in order to make an outsized return on investment on $250 million investment. Or what's your thoughts about this?
So I guess specifically on the Suno and Udio part, they have said publicly that they're confident they have enough money to pay these settlements if they become due, and I think that's probably largely right. I mean, I think they might underestimate how big settlements could be, not least because if it's if they end up with statutory damages in the US, it would be a wild amount of money. But they're not crazy. If you look at the history of things like YouTube or Musical.ly, that the suggestion is that actually, if they've raised enough money, they will be able to scale out of it and they might get better terms on the far side. And so I think when you think about how the investors invested in Suno and Udio, I can see why you would invest in Suno and Udio. Because logically, if you're a capitalist and your intention is to make money, there is a meaningful chance that one or both of those companies will do quite well. And I think it's already been proven that end users are now creators, right? Like I think I used the media statistic of this 30 million people who make music in some form, let's call it some semi-commercially. They release it, whether through a DIY creator or through a major label. There's 30 million people who create music. But what apps like Instagram have taught us is everyone is a photographer. Everyone is a photographer. And what we now seem to see is everyone is a video creator, as TikTok has shown us. And so, we don't yet have a world where everyone is a music creator, because let's be honest, until now, you needed some skill to create music. That's not to suggest that all of those 30 million existing music makers had much skill, but they had enough technical skill to make something and release it. And when you look at people like Suno and Udio, they are moving to the world where you won't need any skill to make music. And so this kind of idea of the Instagram model, right? That kind of removing all barriers to humans creating quality content is well understood by Silicon Valley, by VCs. They understand the idea of everyone wanting to be a creator, and therefore AI is how they can see music becoming sort of barrierless in terms of creation. It's already a very low barrier, to be clear. Like we've moved as an industry. When I first started nearly 20 years ago, you needed skill and probably access to capital to release music, and connections as well, which is why major labels had such strong market share, because stores had limited shelf space. And so and studios cost a lot of money, and home studios weren't yet a thing really in a meaningful sense. And so you think about how hard it was to make music 20 years ago and release it and get it to the end consumer. And you think about where we are now with 30 million music creators, and you think about like now you only need skill. You don't really need any money, right? These DIY solutions, these home studios, they are so good and they're so cost efficient. You can do everything with pretty much nothing. In fact, if you're willing to share in your income, you might need to put nothing up front now, pretty much, as long as you have a little bit of skill. I say a little bit, not necessarily in musically brilliant, but just, you have some skill. But, 30 million compared to the idea of having hundreds of millions of people creating music, or even billions of people creating music. Because then you look at things like Instagram or like TikTok, how many people are creating content on those platforms. It's not a crazy thesis. It's a well-trodden model for the venture capitalists.
But again, if you go back to the Instagram picture and you say, well, everyone could be a photographer, but come back to brand and followers, like not everyone can be an influencer. And I think that's sort of where artistry comes in. And hope for music is, yeah, we might be flooded by quality, like even high quality, but at the end of the day, what's always stuck is the icons, is the big storytellers. And I've been speaking with a lot of people lately, especially here on the podcast. I think episodes to come as well, about branding, about storytelling, and so what makes stand out, and what is the grounding of belief of artistry still being able to go on when these things are happening. And it just all comes back to the storyteller, the people able to follow. And my skepticism to the drama around the impact on music, not from a financial perspective, but on a pursuit perspective, creative perspective, is also that okay, great, well, not great, but like things have changed and that's disruptive, sure. But the base premise of being an artist is still very much there. And that is the connection over time, consistent narrative, having a personal history. And for example, with Suno, if you just made a comparison to Instagram, if a person on Instagram posted, one type of photos that way, that day, and then a completely different another day, and then something different a third day, you won't gain a lot of followers over time because you need to have a consistent narrative. Like that's the whole thing with influencers, even if it's just like professional influencers or, just consumer influencers. And that's the same thing with artistry. Like, do you really believe that, and you haven't said this, but I'm asking the question, do you believe that artistry is in danger from what's happening with music creation? Or is it entirely something different that is in danger?
I think as the barriers to music creation have reduced, it has flooded the market with music. And it is probably true to some extent that it has made it even more challenging for those professional creators, music creators we love, to make a profit off their music. But because I guess, our we said before, right, our time is, as humans, each one of our days are finite. There's 24 hours in every day, and we have access to so much more music now that even the people we love probably get ultimately less money from us. And that's a perfect storm of lots of things, right? Like, that's not to suggest it's not purely because Spotify has production music and therefore people now listen to more mood music. Like, I think we discussed the Stim writer who was number 3 top
No.
writer in 2023, who was writing for Epidemic Sound. Like, it's not to suggest that that's sinister or it's not to suggest users are incorrect. Users listen to more music now than they ever did before, but on a per capita basis, the money we pay for music hasn't kept up. You look at people like myself, or maybe you, I don't know. When I was buying music 20 years ago, I was buying maybe £50 worth of CDs a month. So I didn't have a vinyl player then, and then I was also paying for OD2. Crazy, for my time limited downloads. So I was probably, as a poor student, I was probably spending 65 a month on music before I considered live music. That was just for my recorded sort of products or my distributed music. And you think now, it's hard to spend as much money. Like, what I do now is I try and patronize my favorite artists aggressively. This is quite a funny example, like Little Sims over here, that's her previous album, but the other wall has the latest album. I even bought a CD. I don't own a CD player, but I felt like my natural spend now, I've got Spotify serving all of my needs for music. Let's be frank, it is Spotify in my case. And I only have to pay them, well, I think I'm paying them give or take £12 a month, because it's just me and my home. And I'm not going to cheat the system and have a family account and give it to my friends. And so my £12 a month spend feels insignificant. And I don't feel like I spend enough money on music ultimately. So what I then do is go out of my way to buy pre-order vinyl and buy the special edition ones. And in this case, for the Little Sims latest release, I bought the CD because I was like, let me buy as much as I can, because I wanted to sort of increase my spend on music. But the reality is, like, you have to make a really concerted effort now to spend what you did, equivalent to what you did before 20 years ago as a music lover. And even the end users, you look at like the mass market who never were big fans of music. who maybe listened to the radio and bought a couple of Now CDs and a couple of compilations and maybe one artist album a year, that's probably still more than they are paying for music now. And if you look at it in terms of the cost of capital, the combination of inflation, etc., they were probably spending on average maybe £10 a month on music, maybe 5 on average. And if you look at what that is now, that's the equivalent of them spending probably more like 8. Well, we're not getting £8 out of the average music consumer anymore, right? So I think this is not to suggest it's any specific person's fault, but is it harder for commercially successful artists that we love to survive now than before? Yes. And it's not the fault of any one thing. It's a perfect storm of factors: globalization, digitization, and so all of that's true. But then when you add in the risk of AI, I can see why people are seeing this as a black hole, frankly, because they're already struggling to make money with the existing models and live a sort of sustainable life as professional music creators. And they're already struggling to compete against a sea of DIY created music. And to add to the idea of this is how it is now with 30 million music creators. Well, what if we have 500 million music creators, but we only still have the same current streaming services, etc.? We're going to have to solve the revenue sources. We're going to need to sort of 50x our income as an industry if we're going to sort of dramatically increase the number of available musical assets, but not increase the income, not very, very substantially increase the income. So I can see why people are concerned. I think you can see a world where all kind of UGC implementations use non-human created music, and all background music is non-human created, and that accounts for a crap ton of the music we listen to as a society. And so I get why people are it's not just a moral concern, it's also an economic concern. People who invested their life into creating music, and these are people we are fans of, right? Bands we love are concerned about this, or artists or writers we love are concerned about this stuff, and I can see why.
I think that's a brilliant way of describing it and sort of nuancing it. And I think one of the big takeaways I have for these type of discussions, and especially while you were talking, I was thinking about, is the perceived value and the actual value of music are both very, very low right now. And as the creation or the barrier of entry lowers and much more people are creating music, I think both of them could also be negatively affected. The perceived value of what does it mean to pay for music, and the actual value of music, because that's going to be a subsequent reaction to the perceived value of music as well from consumer behavior. And that delusion is difficult. And obviously there's nothing we can do to just, stop technology. And there is a hope for the legal systems to make some sort of solution to this. But in reality, that's going to have limited effect. So you might disagree, but this is how I see it. Are we fucked?
Are we fucked? Goodness. So if I'm trying to think how to best describe this, let me formulate for a second. So I was going to say something to the effect of when we spoke last time round, in major jurisdictions like the UK, US, and most European jurisdictions, it felt fair to say that there was little clear existing legal evidence that would suggest that you could train a model without a license, train a model on commercial music without a license, or just generally copyrighted items. And so, our existing laws in the UK and the US and most European markets, to my knowledge, and don't provide strong evidence that you could do that without a license, right? And in some cases, like in the UK, they clarified that things like so there was an exception for data mining. In the UK, our government clarified that exception didn't apply for this use case. So 9 months ago, you would have said, or I would have said at least, it felt like there was a good chance that in major jurisdictions it would be deemed you needed a license to train after going through the courts. But for the first time in my life, it feels like copyright it's become something that is hyper political. Now, lots of people say, well, it was already political, but actually that's not true. If you think about it, really, in big markets like Europe, UK, US, depending on how you include Europe geographically, in UK and Europe geographically, largely copyright was kind of a bipartisan issue, with some anomalies like US radio where they don't pay royalties. So like major political parties in most of these kind of Western markets supported copyright in a decent form. But AI might be the point at which we diverge politically. Times are changing. I think in the US, the last 6 months have shown us that maybe copyright protection is no longer a bipartisan issue. The sacking of various copyright office executives, the public statements of powerful political people, very generic description, have suggested that some of the people in power in the US particularly, but probably also in Europe, are not fans of copyright. I think there was one quote which was something to the effect of like, fuck, to your point, fuck IP. The irony of that person is they built their wealth on IP, just a different kind of IP. They built their wealth on trademarks and patents, and what they actually meant was fuck copyright. But that's because they wanted to use copyright free of licensing. So I think, to your point earlier, there is I disagree, to your earlier point about like, are lawmakers, are courts going to save us? We have to compel them to. We have to use a moral argument and a commercial argument to compel them to. But 9 months ago, it felt like it was probably going to come down in the industry's favour. It was going to the law kind of largely suggested that they needed a license. The reality, unfortunately, is that, you look at a report that the Copyright Office rushed out that said there was basically a need, you have to get a license. And then the Copyright Office head was sacked. I think the reality is, it doesn't seem like there's much appetite in the US to require licenses. And so, recent lawsuits that have been found in the last few weeks have mixed signals. But I think we as an industry need to make a stronger moral and commercial argument to our respective political leaders about the importance of protecting human copyright. And I realize that could sound like it's contradicting what I said earlier. I'm not suggesting that, again, machine outputs shouldn't have some kind of protections on them, but we should be looking after human created copyrights. Otherwise, I think we are fucked as an industry. Yes, I do think that's true, unfortunately. I don't think the game is over. The law is not yet clear. We haven't entirely decided matters properly. There's no Supreme Court ruling. And even if it was determined by the Supreme Court you don't need a license to train, which is possible. If the Supreme Court in the US decides that the use of inputs to train models to create outputs is a transformative enough use case that they don't need licensing, like what was described, the Google Books example. So if it's considered transformative enough, they don't need licenses. I don't think that's true, but if they did, well, okay, so that might be true based on the current law. But then, frankly, the music industry would be crazy not to then be lobbying to change the laws, right? So I think this is going to be a really, really long-standing battle. But it is understandable to feel very concerned about the future. And I think we've got probably a couple of years to turn this round, or otherwise, neither of us will be working in music. And frankly, very few people will be working in music if we're not careful, other than those who manage the large language models or run the DSPs, which will probably increasingly be using music generated by large language models.
it's so refreshing hearing that take, because that's what I'm thinking all the time. But it's so hard to, let me say it this way. This should be misunderstood, but I'm on the way out of music when it comes to me thinking long term industry wise. I'm still very much present from a technology perspective. I still believe that there's much to be had and much to be won from that perspective. But I am so concerned and so confused about this that I'm out of music itself, and that's a decision I've made, and that's for sure. I'm not even half out. I'm out, and that for me is rather perplexing to say. But I can just see it, like the insecurity of the future combined with the incredible insecurity of the present and also the past just doesn't add up. For example, for me as an entrepreneur, like. But I do want to say that I'm still here for technology. I'm still here for the surrounding elements of it. But the concept of music itself, when it comes to representing artists, songwriters, publishing companies, I'm not saying they're doomed. I'm just saying, me personally, I'm out, because I was so conflicted about the attractiveness of doing the work and the conversation in that space that already now, like, I can't combine it with the insecurity of the future either. And I'm not trying to change anyone's mind on this topic, but like, I'm already being affected, and these are sort of the first ripple effects I also see in other people. That, heck, is this where we want to take a chance? And I believe that's the saddest part. I've called it out many times in this podcast that I believe that the capacity and capability of industry people could be significantly higher in general. And one of the reasons for why that maybe is not so is that it's not an attractive industry, or understandably so, at scale, at large. And these kind of elements does not positively contribute to that fact. And that for me is the fuck part, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess I don't think. I guess my assessment is there is. It is possible that we are fucked, but I guess you already feel like it is.
Yeah, I do.
I think we still have some time to turn it around. I think that takes. I still think there's some light. There's still possible light at the end of the tunnel, because I do think the industry is passionate and smart, and no one really works in music for the money. You work in music for the love of it, right? And so, like, we would all earn more money working at banks or other things like that. And so I still see some light at the end of the tunnel, or some possible light at the end of the tunnel. But depending on what you're doing in music, it, like, for example, some kinds of production music, I could see why people would be sort of shutting down the hatches, right? Like, there is, and or like, if you are someone who has never managed to get a foothold, it's only getting tougher. So, whether it's someone who has commercial success in an area that's already being savaged by AI, or in an area that, or in a career that never has really yet, it never has flourished, then I could understand why it feels unappealing. I'm still super passionate about it, and I still think we have time to turn it around. But I do think there's a lot of concern, whether it be our lawmakers changing the laws, or sort of forcing the courts to rule that there isn't a license needed to train, or whether in a world where we do license, but the outputs are free of copyright, and therefore we end up with sort of 1 billion tracks available on every streaming service. Like, that is a pretty bleak world. Someone made a really compelling comment to me at Music Ally Next last week, something to the effect of, essentially what we probably need to do is have DSPs like Spotify, like Apple, etc., only carry human creation. Of course, that's a kind of, as much as Deezer suggests otherwise, it's not so easy to be sure what is
No.
where the line is drawn, because as much as they say otherwise, those algorithms are imperfect still. you can detect certain models, you can detect artifacts of AI large language models, but the reality is, do we want hundreds? Do we want to have like the current volume of tracks only 10x or 50x? I don't think that's good for anyone. Doesn't mean that music shouldn't be made. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be available somewhere. This person was making a play for the suggestion that we should have two tiers of services: commercial music services and everything else. I'm not suggesting that is a solution, but I can see why there's people see a bit of a bleak future. I still think we have time to turn it around, but I do think we have to change our thinking around the outputs.
And the most interesting part is, I get a lot of clever people on this podcast, and some of the people that I consider the smartest are some of our common friends. And a few episodes ago, we had two common friends on the podcast in two different episodes. The first one was Dan Fowler, and the second one was Daniel Norgård, the professor. And it's a very interesting contrast, because basically Dan and Daniel are probably top 5, the two smartest people I know in the music industry, and they were so on the opposite end of the spectrum of like when it comes to outlook of the industry, where Dan was very bleak. He's obviously incredibly intelligent and sometimes a bit hard to sort of comprehend the complexity of what he thinks, but very bleak about it. And then I was talking with Daniel, which is probably the most knowledgeable music industry guy I know, and I know a lot of people. And he was so optimistic. And I think that's also maybe like for me, what I just need to navigate is like the people that I respect the most in the world also have opposite opinions or opposite outlooks, and that really signifies how unclear it is what's going on right now, and hence also our conversation today. Becky, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if we want to put up a some sort of like visual spectrum of outlook of industry, and putting Dan on one side that you know and Daniel on the other side that you know, where would you place yourself on that hope scale?
I'm roughly in the middle. I'll oscillate in either direction, but I average somewhere in the middle, because I share a number of Dan Fowler's reservations, but I also still have some hope, like Daniel Norgård. And so, like you said, I know both of them. I often sit in the rooms with both of them at the same time, and I don't think I'm all positive, all negative. I think actually I'm sort of about some things I'm negative, about some things I'm positive. I think we still, like I said, we still have time to turn things round, but there is lots of challenges, lots and lots of challenges ahead. And so I would say I'm somewhere in the middle, but that's not to suggest I always sit in the middle. I'm not a fence sitter, as they would say in the UK, but I average out somewhere in the middle.
And maybe my last comment on that is, when I talk with Daniel, I sit emotionally with Dan Fowler, like reaction wise. And he's much more intelligent than me, so he actually has arguments. I just sit there emotionally. But then when I listen to Daniel speak, and I know enough to know where I don't know, and this guy, he knows so incredibly much, and I'm just like, thank you for blessing me with knowledge. And I'm inspired by the way that he argued for hope. But I can't seem to get out of this hopelessness, if that makes sense. And that's just the honesty I want to have to the podcast, that if I want to intellectually place my faith somewhere, I place it with the hope intellectually. But I can't be there emotionally, if that makes sense. And
yeah, that's interesting. I guess I'm very lucky that day to day, I talk to startup founders who, I guess you have to be a little delusional and sort of crazy mad scientist to want to found a startup in music tech. I mean, I'm using that very loosely. What I mean in senses like, I talk to people who are wildly optimistic every day, and that kind of brings me background. It tempers my concerns, it tempers my reservations, and so maybe that's good. Maybe that helps give me that balance. I don't know if that helps you at all, but talking to startup founders who can't see all the barriers, can't see all the hurdles, can't see all the problems, as long as they're willing to understand those things, that working with them kind of gives me quite a lot of balance. And I'm excited because lots of these people are working really hard to deliver something truly innovative and exciting, whether it be um, a AI algorithm for multi-track mixing in the case of someone like a Roex historically, or I've got a client now who are building a Belgian specific streaming service and are really trying to support particularly independent created, probably now mostly major owned Belgian artists specifically. I find myself really passionate day to day about the products my clients are building, and then I spend a lot of my time, I said this before, a lot of my emotional energy trying to advocate and trying to agitate even for the industry to make just basic licensing easier. Because if we can't make that easier, if we can't drive a diversity of DSPs, for example, I think we're going to be in trouble, because we double back to the point that these large language models that we're suing, etc., are largely funded by the same companies that also own the current biggest DSPs. And so it would be naive not to see some rephrase that. It would be naive not to see some strategy in investing in large language models that might provide you limitless free music. That is the word for sure. And so if the industry can't encourage new DSPs, it can't encourage new entrants, new innovation. And I say innovation, I mean this sort of separate from the generative type. I mean like new services, new user experiences, whatever. If we can't encourage those things along, new also pure play services, because Spotify still is largely a pure play service, but increasingly they're trying to move away from being a pure play music service because it's so hard to make a margin in music. We need to foster a healthy underlying music industry that cares about human creation. And so I often feel a bit disillusioned, like you seem to at the moment. But I do also know that when I talk to the people who do these deals with power, most of them understand it. So maybe we just need to be sort of shouting louder, and maybe to eat it to the most senior executives in the industry about this. Because in a world, I presented about this at South by Southwest in Austin this year. It was like, in a world where we only have sort of 5 big platforms, and they also have major investments in large language models, and you don't need a license to train, I think it's a very, very bleak future. So we need to be doing everything we can to address politically and legally the AI models, but we also need to be building a more healthy, sustainable flow of innovation for services, for user experiences, so that we have more people innovating in this space who actually care about music, who are pure play services. And thankfully, I'm lucky to work with people like that every day. And so it keeps me more optimistic. But, I wouldn't pretend that things are perfect at all.
I think this is a good place to leave part 2 of our conversation and return to part 3. In let's say 3 months, let's say 6 months. Let's see the timeline.
Probably another 9, because if it goes to the Supreme Court, it's going to take even longer.
But yeah, I think. Thank you so much for being on, Becky. It's been a few interesting weeks, and maybe just in the closing remark, before this call, we just discussed some things that just happened recently. Maybe you can just explain that a bit, and maybe this is a good place to sort of set the scene that we need to continue for next time.
Sounds great. So you're absolutely right. I think depending on what side of the fence you're on, there's been lots of interesting outcomes. So there was a high profile case between Anthropic, and essentially Anthropic has prevailed in this particular example for book publishers. And similarly, I'll say similarly, at least there was a Meta lawsuit, another lawsuit with authors suing Meta for training their model. And both of these came out 2 days apart earlier this week. And I guess actually, I mean, I can very, very briefly summarize what I understand as a non-lawyer the findings are. But actually, if I'm honest, what it really shows us is what I said earlier, which is actually things are getting murkier, not clearer in the short term. Now, that's often the case with these kind of lawsuits where there's widespread infringement, and so different judges find different things and only get some decisive position from the Supreme Court. But essentially, one of the judges, the Anthropic judge, ruled in Anthropic's favour because they said that it is a transformative use. What I mentioned earlier, it's like Google Books. They're saying that Anthropic was using it in such a transformative manner that it was fair use, and therefore no license was needed. So Anthropic won. Now, Meta also won, but fascinatingly, the judge said very different things. So the judge in the Meta lawsuit was saying essentially that Meta had won, but their commentary was basically suggesting it is not a transformative use, and so what this really shows us is that we're probably going to end up having to go to a Supreme Court, in the US at least, to have guidance on this. We're probably 2 years to 3 years from having real clarity, unless there is some political intervention between now and then. And that's probably true in most Western markets.
So incredibly interesting. Becky, thank you for being on.
Thank you for having me.